Charlotte Smith looked sadly at the suitcases in her living room, filled with her personal belongings, and wiped away a tear. Well, here we are. I lived the better half of my life in this house, and now, in the winter of my life, I have to leave it and go into the unknown, thought the old woman with bitterness. She loved her small, cozy house on Main Street very much. Charlotte Smith's best years were now in the past. Thanks to her hard work and perseverance, she'd held numerous senior positions at the city's enterprises. It felt like every single resident of the city knew Mrs. Smith and rushed to show her their respect at every opportunity. Mrs. Smith's husband passed away 8 years ago, and she'd been living alone ever since then. Her marriage to Henry lasted almost 40 years. They raised 2 children together. Roxy and Peter were a year apart and left the family home as soon as they turned 18. The two were young and tempted by the freedom and the life their parents couldn't provide them. Over time, Roxy and Peter settled down and even started their own families. Neither the children's age nor their marital status could change their consumerist attitude towards life. Claiming to be busy all the time, Roxy and Peter paid exceptionally rare visits to their parents who weren't young anymore and were facing a ton of problems and chronic illnesses. Last time Charlotte saw her kids was at their father's funeral. Peter and Roxy's involvement in their elderly mother's life was pretty much limited to short phone calls. But a month ago, the children's attitude towards Charlotte Smith suddenly changed drastically. Roxy visited her mother in person and even brought her some groceries and medicine. Looking at her daughter carefully, Mrs. Smith immediately understood that she was in for a serious conversation. "Mom, here's the thing. Peter and I, we thought, well, we're having some financial difficulties. We need you to sell the house," said Roxy calmly. Having heard her daughter's words, Charlotte's head went fuzzy and her mouth went dry. "But where am I supposed to live, honey?" asked the woman nervously. In response, Roxy mumbled something rather vague about working on it with Peter. Charlotte Smith asked for some time to think it over, but she already made the decision in her heart. The woman wanted to say goodbye to the house, which was home to so many of her beautiful memories. Charlotte also wanted to inform her neighbor and good friend, April Douglas, about moving out. Despite the fact that the young woman already had her own family, she took the old lady's moving very hard. "Don't forget us, Mrs. Smith, and please come visit us," said April when they were saying their goodbyes and hugged the old lady. They found a buyer for Mrs. Smith's house pretty quickly. That was partly due to the fact that they set the price significantly lower than the market level. "I guess Roxy and Peter really need the money if they sold the house so quickly," thought the old lady with sadness. Despite the fact that all of Charlotte's things fit into 3 suitcases, Roxy only allowed her to bring 1. "Mom, don't bring all this junk with you. My house is too small, and Dylan won't be happy about it. He's got quite the temper," said Roxy in a tone that wasn't open to any objections. With tears in her eyes, Charlotte decided to only take the suitcase that held old photos, which captured her entire life. To Mrs. Smith's disappointment, her daughter's husband's reaction to the frail old lady moving into their house was rather negative. He used every opportunity to let Charlotte know that her presence made him feel disgusted. "She's up all night, wandering around the house, and I need to get my rest at the end of the day. Talk to Peter. Maybe he's got better living conditions. It's his mother too, after all," said Dylan through his teeth. That evening, Roxy called her brother and asked him to help her out. Of course, from the very moment at her daughter's house, poor Mrs. Smith knew that she wouldn't be staying there long. Not 2 weeks later, Peter came over in his old pickup truck to get the old lady. "Maybe I'll actually be welcome there," thought Charlotte Smith with tears in her eyes. Unfortunately, the old lady had no idea how wrong she was. The problem was that Peter's wife, Monica, took a dislike to her mother-in-law from the first moment they met. Standing in the doorway, confused, the old lady didn't know how to act or what to do next. Peter's attitude turned out to be no better than the one Mrs. Smith got from her daughter. "My kids don't want me. I took care of them for so many years. I raised them, and now this is how they repay me," thought Charlotte, distraught. She had been living in Peter's house for about 2 weeks when Monica gave her husband an ultimatum. "You're going to have to choose. It's either me or that old bag. I can't stand her being here anymore," screamed the woman angrily. "Where am I supposed to take her? I can't just kick her out onto the street. I need to discuss it with Roxy and put her in a nursing home or something," Peter blurted out. The man didn't know that Mrs. Smith was an accidental witness to their conversation, as she went into the kitchen to get a glass of water before bed. Well, here we are again, and they're not even trying to be discreet in their conversations about trying to get rid of me, thought the old lady with sadness. To Peter's surprise, his sister's reaction to his proposal was rather lukewarm. "In case you forgot, we'd also have to pay for a nursing home, brother. And let me tell you, it isn't cheap. Sure, if you have some cash laying around, then be my guest. But don't count on my contribution," Roxy snapped. Not knowing what to do next, Peter spent the next several days feeling sad and nervous. The man tried to come up with a way to gently break the news to his mother that she was no longer welcome in his home. However, there was one thing that Peter didn't take into account. Once she looked her son in the eyes, Charlotte Smith understood everything without a word, and having packed her suitcase yet again, went for the exit. Meanwhile, neither Mrs. Smith's son nor her daughter-in-law showed any desire to see her off. Carrying her old suitcase in one hand, the old lady slowly walked through the city and remembered the time in her life when everything was still going well. The occasional passerby tried to stay away from the old crying lady. They couldn't bear the sight of all the emotions that she had gone through over the past 2 months, reflected on her face. Charlotte Smith walked and had completely lost track of time. Unintentionally, the old lady took a turn to the street where her old house was. Mrs. Smith was shocked when she saw that it had been knocked down by the new owner, who had plans to build an elite mansion in this place. Now, in the place where her home once was, there was a wasteland surrounded by a ribbon and a sign informing that there was construction in progress. Charlotte Smith sat down on a bench in the shadow of an ancient elm tree, closed her eyes, and started crying again. It felt as though the tears helped her get rid of the internal pain, which had been chaining her tortured soul. The old lady was brought out from her sad thoughts by a pleasant woman's voice, which seemed very familiar. Charlotte looked up and saw the worried face of her neighbor, April Douglas. "Mrs. Smith, long time no see. Why are you crying?" asked the woman. The old woman could barely give a coherent response to such a painful question. Her heart was pounding from the hurt her children caused her and their cruel treatment. But despite her embarrassment, Charlotte Smith told her neighbor all about her problem. After hearing out the old lady, April furrowed her brow and then said, "Let's go to my place, ma'am. My husband and I are orphans, and our children never had a grandmother. I think that Kevin and Ethan will be really happy to see you." Charlotte thought that she had misheard the young woman at first, and that everything that just happened was just a fragment of her imagination. But when Mrs. Smith looked into April's eyes, the old lady realized that she was being serious. In her neighbor's house, Charlotte was greeted very warmly and surrounded with such care that she could only dream of. The little pranksters Ethan and Kevin listened to Mrs. Smith's bedtime stories with delight. Even April herself, having grown up in an orphanage, was up for chatting about life with a woman who was old enough to be her mother. Moreover, her husband Robert Douglas didn't seem to mind another person living in the house in the least. In April's family, Charlotte once again felt like a woman who could spend hours in the kitchen cooking something tasty to treat her family. Since the town was small, the news of their mother having moved in with their neighbor quickly traveled to Roxy and Peter. "How did we end up like this? Our mother is embarrassing us by living with her neighbor," said Roxy, annoyed to her brother. But Peter looked down with a deep sense of guilt for everything that's happened. The truth was that Peter had recently talked to April Douglas, who was very judgmental of what he did. However, despite being tortured by guilt, Peter still didn't do anything to help his own mother. At the end of the day, it all came down to the fact that Peter had sacrificed his values and disowned his mother. However, justice was served when Charlotte Smith put together her will. April was to receive a substantial amount of money, which had been secretly sitting in the old lady's bank account, which her kids knew nothing about. Charlotte and Henry Smith made this deposit over 30 years ago to provide for their children's future. Nobody but Mrs. Smith and her late husband knew about this bank account. Over time, thanks to the interest, the deposit turned into a hefty sum, which the old lady left to the family that took her in. "We don't need any of your money, Mrs. Smith. Just keep on living, please," said April with tears in her eyes. Charlotte smiled mysteriously in response and went into the kitchen to make some pancakes for Kevin and Ethan, who were like grandchildren to her by now. Smiling blissfully, the old lady was simply doing what she loved and refused to think about anything bad anymore. Now that Charlotte had a new family, there would no longer be any hurt feelings or betrayal in her life, which she was surrounded with thanks to her greedy kids who simply abandoned her out on the streets.